The ISA lecture brings to campus notable experts in fields related to environment and sustainability. The lecture was established in honor of William Lewis Chapin ISA, and I'd like to especially thank his parents, Nancy and Bill, who are in the audience with us this evening. And this evening, we have Donald A. Brown, who is the Scholar in Residence for Sustainability, Ethics, and Law at the Widener Law Center. He is the former director of the Pennsylvania Environmental Research Consortium, an organization of 56 Pennsylvania universities and the departments of Resources, Environmental Protection, and Conservation. He previously worked as program manager for the United Nations organizations at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of International Environmental Policy. He represented the agency on U.S. delegations to the UN team negotiating climate change, biodiversity, and sustainable development. Professor Brown has written about and lectured extensively on climate change issues over the last 20 years. His interest has been focused on the need to integrate environmental science, economics, and law in environmental policymaking. His latest book, American Heat: Ethical Problems with the U.S. Response to Global Warming. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to Professor Brown.
I am so happy to be here. This is obviously a professional class of people that expects some serious discussion of important ideas. I can tell from the look of this place. So when I teach, I have taught the science, ethics, politics of climate change at Penn State for a number of years. And I now teach the law and ethics at the Widener University School of Law. I start all of my classes with the following claim. If you don't find what we're about to talk about is interesting, there are two possibilities. One possibility is I'm a bad teacher. Okay. The other possibility is you have no beating heart. I think I can convince you, among other things, this is an extraordinarily interesting, troubling, and completely consistent with the theme of revolution for reasons which I will explain. I'm going to argue that climate change and some global environmental problems raise obvious ethical and moral problems, but we don't talk about them. And that climate change in particular raises obvious ethical questions, but somehow and for some reason they're missing from the public discourse about this problem. I have been in the middle of this for 25 years. I was a negotiator. I was the Pennsylvania representative to the Earth Summit in 1992, so I have been right in the middle of this. And I'm going to argue that this is extraordinarily important. It's practically important to see the moral dimensions of this issue. But yet, the press isn't picking up. It's not reporting the ethical and moral issues. We pretend that this is just like any other environmental problem. So that's what I'm up to. Before I do it, there are three things that the press does not talk about in this problem. Even though the press is now saying that climate change is back on the radar because of Sandy, it's still not covering things you got to understand to really get this problem. There are things about this problem that I suspect, even though there are, everybody in this room has a graduate degree or an undergraduate degree, I suspect there are aspects of this problem that you are not fully aware of. But you really have to get it. To understand the ethical issues, you have to understand the science. You have to understand the economics. So I'm going to run through some of the aspects of this problem which set up the ethical questions first. A number of things you have to understand to really get it is what the nature of the scientific consensus on this issue. What do we mean by consensus? What is it? You have to understand the scope of the problem, the magnitude of reductions that the mainstream scientific institutions are saying that the world needs to prevent really catastrophic warming. The ethical questions only fully set them up when you understand that, okay? And you have to understand that this is obviously an ethical and moral problem. There are aspects of this issue, unlike other environmental issues, although all environmental issues have these issues, but you can get away with not talking about them. But this problem, you can't get away without sort of focusing. In the counter negotiations this year on climate change, justice and ethics was at the core of the disputes at the international community. More on that in a second. So they're the three things you got to get before we can get to the ethics. There's been a 35-year debate about climate change. I have actually a new book. It's called Navigating the Perfect Moral Storm, which I rigorously go through what that debate was about, okay? The debate has been framed in the United States through two kinds of frames. One is scientific certainty, do we have enough science? And the other is economic impacts, largely to the United States. So when you look at opposition that started in the early 1980s, by the mid-1980s, the opponents of doing anything were making 95% of the time claims that the science was weak or that it would cost the US economy. Okay. And what did the environmental community do in response to those claims? They also framed them as scientific and economic claims. So often the environmental community's response was to say, no, everything is settled, okay, that there are no scientific issues, okay. That's not really true, as we will see. There are still some things which are not completely settled. The consensus view is not a consensus on all things. It's a range of upper and lower bounds of what we think is going to happen with confidence levels associated with it. The environmental community, in response to the claims that it will cost the US economy too much, said, no, this will create jobs. We'll go to jobs. The obvious ethical issues with those arguments, no one is talking about it. But there are obvious ethical and moral problems with those arguments. So let me run real quickly through some of the science. There is something called the consensus view. The consensus view is not a consensus on all things. The consensus view is the planet is heating up. That is as certain as we can get for lots of reasons. Two, there's 95% confidence levels that it's human caused despite natural variability. There are multiple lines there's 15, 20 different independent lines of evidence of human causation. But you'll hear people say, politicians saying, there's no evidence of human causation. That is not responsible skepticism. That's a lie. There's lots of evidence of human causation. And the third part of it is that there's probably really harsh consequences to the world's poorest people more than anyone else, if we under business as usual. This could be really ugly for the human race if we don't get this problem under control. That's what the consensus position is. There's uncertainty of something called climate sensitivity, which is how much warming do you get with different atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, but a lot more will be said about that. The consensus view is supported according to Nature and Science by 97 to 98% of the scientists that actually do peer-reviewed research. The United States Academy of Sciences issued 4 separate reports supporting the consensus view. Every Academy of Science in the world that has issued a statement, there's at least 20 of them, have issued statements that they support the consensus view. Every scientific organization who has members relevant to climate science, there's like 110 of them, say that they support the consensus view. But how could it be that you have every person running for president says that the entire science is a hoax? What is going on here? How could that be? And I will argue that it's in part we don't know how to talk about science, which is a whole other story. The American Association for the Advancement of Science issued this statement in 2009, summing up what the consensus is, and says, these conclusions are based upon multiple independent lines of evidence, and contrary assertions are inconsistent with objective assessment of the peer-reviewed science. That statement was signed by 18 of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the United States. There is something called the consensus view. It's not a consensus about all things, but there is strong agreement. Most of the basic physics of this problem was understood by 1858, okay? We've known since the late 19th century precisely if you add a molecule of carbon dioxide, what the initial forcing will be, okay? A lot of the physics has not been in question. The real issue is how much warming you get with different concentrations, and it gets really complicated because there are positive and negative feedbacks in the climate system. Another part of the consensus view is that the climate system has been extraordinarily stable for 10,000 years. Carbon dioxide was at 280 parts per million, but if you go back about 12,000 years ago, you can see rapid changes in the climate system. There are thresholds which trigger rapid nonlinear responses of the climate system of many different types. Part of the consensus view is we're going to trigger, at some point, rapid nonlinear responses of the climate system. Now, the scientific community doesn't know exactly where these thresholds are, but they're out there, okay? And so all the scientific community can do is, excuse me one second, is try to put upper and lower probability bounds on where they are. And out of that has come an agreement that it would be catastrophically stupid to allow the warming to be more than 2 degrees centigrade. But this two charts, the one on the left is the higher the red, the higher the probability that you have rapid nonlinear responses. This one was done around 2004, and this is a recent one. It's getting worse, okay? That the probabilities are getting worse. It is, in fact, the case that the mainstream scientific organizations that are covering this are screaming about the urgency of this problem. These are some of the nonlinear responses in the climate system that we know were there. I'll give an example of one. There are methane hydrates in the bottom of the ocean. 55 million years ago, if the ocean got warm enough, it liberated all the methane, and there was almost, within 10 or 15 years, there was a 5 degree centigrade increase, okay, rapid increase. There are lots of problems that the scientists are worrying about that we're going to trigger, and it's theoretically possible that the whole thing could get out of control, although not probable in the short term that it will get out of control, but it's still theoretically possible that if we have 3 or 4 degrees centigrade, we start to lose all the sinks, and all of a sudden the warming really increase dramatically. It is theoretically possible that if the forests, which are storing all this carbon, if the temperature change, it's not the magnitude, it's the rapidity of the change, we could kill the forest, which liberates the carbon. So now here's another part that people don't understand. If 2 degrees centigrade is the level at which you start to have really worries that you're going to have rapid nonlinear, the next problem is what atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases will allow me to have any confidence that you're going to limit the warming to 2 degrees centigrade. Okay. And the story is amazing. Okay, at 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent, you have, because there's uncertainty with climate sensitivity, there's a 45 to 86% chance that you can't limit the warming to 2 degrees centigrade. Something else that people don't know. A lot of people know that we're 394 parts per million of carbon dioxide, but we're at 340 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent because the other methane gases. Okay, so we're starting to bump up against real limits of prudence in the climate system. And here's the other part of this problem that the science is saying that people do not get. To limit the warming to 2 degrees centigrade was going to require hard-to-imagine reductions globally. This chart shows you the steepness of the curve. If you try to limit it to 2 degrees centigrade, and this is 1.5 degrees centigrade, there's actually considerable science that 2 degrees is too much that will trigger these nonlinear responses. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the UN are studying whether it should not be 2 degrees but 1.5 degrees. Of course, all the developing countries want the limit to be 1.5 degrees, okay, because they're the ones that are hardest hit in the negotiations. So that's a matter that is trying to sort itself out in the negotiations. Here's another thing that people do not know. The longer you wait to peak global emissions, the steepness of the curve to prevent the 2 degrees warming becomes hard to imagine. Hard to imagine. So, you know, if we wait till 2020, you have to have 7 to 8% per year. The worst recessions only have a reduction in economic activity of a couple percent per year. This is a staggering challenge for the human race. If the mainstream scientific view is incorrect, this is a civilization and challenging problem. Another thing people that don't know, that an intergovernmental panel on climate change has been articulating this. The empirical data is showing for most of them we're worse than worst case. This is sea level rise, emissions, temperature increases are near the top of what IPCC predicted what in fact would happen. And so I'm going to talk about the negotiations in a second. In order to limit the warming to 2 degrees centigrade, once you decide what the atmospheric concentration is, you can develop a budget of how many tons of carbon will give you that concentration in the atmosphere. So if you want to try to stabilize at 450 parts per million, which is only a 50% probability that you'll limit the warming to 2 degrees centigrade, you can calculate, it's fairly simple mathematics, to calculate how many tons between now and 2050 the whole world can emit, and it's something like 44,000 gigatons between now and then. So we know it's pretty easy to figure out what the whole world should do in terms of how many tons should be emitted to get you to an atmospheric concentration level. And as I will explain in a little bit, what we're doing now is way short of any hope of limiting the warming to 2 degrees centigrade. Just more on that in a second. Okay, I'm not going to switch. So that's the kind of stuff you got to know to get into the ethics. And for reasons which are very curious to me, we don't really know how to talk about ethics, okay, particularly in environmental policy. Very few, there is this field of environmental ethics out there, which it's mostly academics talking to each other about human nature relationships. They talk to themselves. Policymakers don't read their stuff. Even NGOs, there's something we feel funny in the United States about talking about the ethical dimensions of public policy. And that in itself is an interesting phenomenon to think about. I think there are several reasons for that. People will say, well, if it's an ethical problem, who decides? Doesn't anything count? More on that in a second. But this problem raises obvious ethical issues that the world cannot duck. And why is that? Well, it's a problem that people in one part of the world are putting other people in the world at risk. You have really high emitters. It's a problem that has this amazing asymmetry between who's causing the problem and who is at risk, okay? Small island developing states in negotiations have been screaming for 25 years, don't do this to us, okay? The Southeast Asia is extraordinarily vulnerable. Almost all the major river systems are glacier-fed. The Brahmaputra, the Ganges are all glacier-fed. India is already running into water scarcities as the glaciers are disappearing. I could go on. So you have this amazing disconnect between the countries that are causing most of the emissions and the country with the worst impacts are almost all in the harshest are in parts of the world that are already poor. People do not know that if the science is correct, the US is already contributing to flooding around the world, to heat waves around the world. It's US emissions which are partially responsible for things that are already starting to happen. And therefore, it's US interest alone is not the only thing to think about. If this is an ethical problem, we have not only economic interests, which we do and must think about, but we also have duties and responsibilities and obligations to people that that are being affected. Food supplies are being affected. Droughts are being affected. The models disagree in many parts of the world whether it gets warmer or drier, but the models all agree that some parts of the world will get drier, like the Horn of Africa, the Sahel in Africa, and lo and behold, it's getting drier. And we can say with high levels of confidence that it's US emissions, among other emissions, that are contributing to that problem right now. And I can take you to the Horn of Africa, and the human suffering. Dying of starvation or drought is a really ugly death. But yet we act as if only our interests count. More on that in a second. The second reason why this is a moral problem and needs to be understood as a moral problem, because the harms to the affected are not mere inconveniences, they're potentially catastrophic. There are parts of the world that have been screaming for 30 years, don't do this to me, this is a death sentence. The African countries have been getting louder and louder. The small island developing states have been doing it. Africa is a basket case both from drought, food, and a whole variety of impacts. And the third reason why we have to understand this is an ethical problem is because the victims can't petition their governments to protect them. Their governments have no control over the high emitters. The victims' only hope is that the high emitters, both individuals and countries, will see that they not only have economic interests, but they also have duties, responsibilities, and obligations. And so, since for 25 years ago, the victims were saying this is a justice problem, but yet it's completely absent from the press coverage as a justice problem. Now here's another thing that people don't understand about the problem. The atmosphere is like a bathtub. It has limited volume. The natural systems can, like the overflow plug, take some water out of the system, but that's around 20% of what we're currently putting into the system. And here's the thing, is that different countries are putting different volumes of water into the system. The only way you can solve it is get each country do its fair share of the amazing amount of emissions reductions. This is clearly a justice question. Now, why that's so interesting is we don't teach people to think about justice when it comes to environmental policy. I condemn the Academy for doing this. If you get a PhD from the Kennedy School, the only prescriptive tool you're taught is neoclassical economic theory, utilitarian theory. Penn State, PhD students who are really bright, they don't get the obvious ethical questions with doing a cost-benefit analysis. Inside policy offices, there are three kinds of priests. There are lawyers, there are engineers and scientists, and there are economists. And they frame these problems with their tools. The result is, I was with the Clinton administration when the Kyoto Protocol was being debated, and there were two cost-benefit analyses which was at the center of what the United States would do. One was done by EPA and one was done by the Department of Energy. One showed a 2% increase in GDP, and the other showed a 2% decrease in GDP. But the cost-benefit analysis only looked at costs and benefits to the United States alone. We say we only have to consider our interests. And the press didn't pick it up. The Academy didn't pick it up. But the small islands developing states picked it up. In the negotiations, they're saying, United States, how dare you think about your own interests? This is an obvious ethical problem. A monkey would get what's wrong with the United States looking at its interests alone for this particular problem. I didn't show you the United States is by far the largest historical emitter. This is the blue in the United States. So in figuring out how thick the spigots into the, so at the center of the negotiations right now, and it's all new just in the last 3 or 4 years, is what is each country's fair share now that we're starting to bump up against limits. To make a long story short, Obama has promised 17% reduction below 2005 by 2020. It's the weakest of all of the developed countries' commitments that have been made in the climate negotiations. But the world needs 25 to 40% below 1990 levels to achieve to have any confidence. The U.S. position is not only weak, it's way too short, and everybody knows that if you're inside the negotiations. They know my boss, the US is also, the other thing people don't know is the US has been a bad global citizen on this issue for 25 years, okay? I worked for Bill Nitze, who was the lead negotiator for Reagan and George Bush's father when there's a treaty here that the United States actually ratified. Most people don't know that we promised to do all sorts of things under the treaty. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, was only an amendment to that treaty. And the lead negotiator wrote a book. The European Union in 1988 wanted all the developed countries to commit to a target, an enforceable target of 20% below 1990 levels by 2000. And Bill Nitze, who was my boss, wrote and said, US stopped this all by itself. Okay, we stopped the world 25 years ago from agreeing to enforceable target. So are these negotiations. For 22 years we've been going. These are different meetings that have taken place to try to negotiate a solution to this. This is not the only way to solve this, but all of the issues that are in negotiations are going to remain whether we solve this as a UN problem or not. There's still a duty of each country to do its fair share. And so the most recent negotiation was in Qatar. And the whole world has agreed that we got to bring everybody into the treaty. We can't separate it, and it was in the past to developing countries. That seems to be a deal. There are big debates about what the relative responsibilities of developing countries to developed countries. That's all still on the table. So there has been an agreement, though, to negotiate a new treaty and to finish negotiations in 2015, but it won't come into effect until 2020. And the scientific community is saying, wow, that's not fast enough, okay? They're also looking at the 2 degrees C. There's some evidence that 2 degrees C is too much. And all of a sudden, everybody's waking up, really waking up to the ethics and justice issue, I think. I was just blown away in Qatar. 3 years ago, Obama could say 17% below 2005, and everybody clapped their hand because finally the US was in the game, okay? But 3 years later, because we now can calculate what's going to take, people look at the US, it says 17% below, that's only 4%. That's only 4% below 1990 levels by 2020, okay? So the obviousness that the US position is not its fair share is really, really obvious. How is the US doing? Well, can the US even make, you'll hear people now say, well, the US is going to make its commitment, but it's not even going to make its commitment without, it's not even going to make the 17% commitment without additional action on the federal level. There was a Supreme Court case I could talk about, Massachusetts for the United States, where the Supreme Court told that the EPA had a duty to regulate carbon dioxide, and Obama's slowly doing that. But it doesn't look like it's going to even be enough to meet the 17%. It's going to get closer than a lot of people thought, and that's because there's been a recession and people are fuel switching to natural gas and getting out of coal for other reasons. So what I've tried to convince you of, this is obviously an ethical problem. Okay, now let me sort of talk about the ethics and how do we go forward. We need to wake everybody up to the ethical and moral dimensions of this issue. I actually have faith that America will get it sooner or later, okay, that they will see it as a justice. The only question is how much damage we're going to do between now and the wake-up date, but this is a problem. You can't hide, you can't duck the ethical questions. You can't duck the ethical question as to what the US fair share is. Now, ethics, of course, a lot of people not having ethics, they don't even know what I'm talking about when I talk about ethics is the domain of inquiry, that given certain facts, something is right or wrong, obligatory or not obligatory, or when humans have responsibilities for human action. Well, one of the reasons people don't like to talk about ethics, particularly I have an undergraduate degree in engineering science. Some of my engineering students, they don't like ethics because it's messy, because you can't reduce it to an algorithm. And they say, I don't want to talk about that because there's no way of figuring out what the truth is. Well, it's a different kind of problem about factual truth. It's about duties and responsibilities. And there are different ethical theories which lead to actually different conclusions for some of these climate problems. There's some really thorny ethical questions. One of them is, what is the US fair share? That's a really thorny ethical question. If you frame something as an ethical question, there are three possibilities. One is there's actually cross-cultural agreement on what ethics requires. There's a lot of international law norms. There's an international law norm that everybody accepted, that no country can use its economic interest to harm people outside of its jurisdiction. It's called the no harm principle. It's right in the treaty. There are human rights. There's a lot of sort of ethical rules that the human race has actually worked out in terms of what ethics requires of nations. And surprisingly, there's actually about 20 different ethical questions that climate change raises. And surprisingly, what's already been worked out is very, very relevant to the ethical questions. So one possibility is that you get agreement about what ethics requires. Another possibility is you don't get agreement about what ethics requires because we don't agree what abortion is. We don't agree about the right to life. There are some human problems where there are real differences between what people think is right or wrong. Religions have different points of view. Ethical systems have different ethical points of view. But there's another possibility. Another possibility is we may disagree what ethics requires, but we can all spot injustice when we see it, okay? There is agreement that a lot of things fail to pass minimum ethical scrutiny, even if we disagree about what ethics requires. And we should be taking advantage of that fact. And I will now explain to you one of the ways to get traction for ethical issues. So let's go back to the cost argument. Okay, so this has been framed in the United States as if US cost alone, or sometimes globalized cost-benefit analysis, is pure justification for not taking action. But there's some obvious ethical problems. In fact, there's about 20 obvious ethical problems with cost-benefit analysis that particularly are trouble for this problem. One is my country should not be able to use a cost-benefit analysis and kill you because it's in my economic interest. Everybody seems to agree to that, but that's in fact what the US in fact has been doing. Some of the cost-benefit analysis, because it puts everything into dollar terms, we get to decide what the value of an Indian life is, okay, and then do a cost-benefit analysis, which leaves our lost polluters off the hook. That's an ethical problem. I think we are, even very educated, are really poorly educated to just spot the ethical issues, particularly with various kinds of economic arguments. I want to be clear, I'm not saying you don't do the economic analysis, but there are just some limits to this. There are procedural justice and fair justice. In the Kyoto Protocol, we didn't disaggregate who the harms were. We didn't even identify the rest of the world as being harmed by the cost-benefit analysis that we did. Okay. So there are obvious limitations on the use of economic arguments as an excuse for doing nothing. Let's talk about scientific uncertainty. Almost everyone agrees. In fact, the United States agreed in 1992 when it adopted the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that the science was strong enough in 1992 that no nation would use scientific uncertainty anymore as an excuse for not taking action to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with climate change. Figuring out what to do in the face of scientific uncertainty is itself not a science problem, it's an ethical problem at its very core. And here I really condemn higher education. I just had a class with really smart people here this morning. I said, what is the norm that scientists use to decide whether you can publish in their journal? And different sciences are slightly different, but it's at its core, it's not a scientific question. And the answer is some scientists require 95% confidence levels, and you can't publish until you have a certain level of correlation. Each science is interestingly different as to what the norm of that science is. Where did the 95% come from? A guy by the name of Fisher completely made it up, okay? It's not a scientific claim, but it determines what scientists can say in many cases. Modelers use simply, well, predictions have to meet observations, okay? So But the 95% confidence level makes a lot of sense when society's trying to make sure that research is strong enough so that you want to use the research. So for some human problems, putting the burden to show that something is harmful makes a lot of sense. But there are other human problems where putting the burden on the person, on the victim to show that it's not safe is not what ethics would have you do. Every issue of scientific uncertainty raises two ethical questions, at least two. Who should have the burden of proof, given what we know? And what quantitative proof should satisfy the burden of proof? The law is sort of schizophrenic about this. It has different standards, whether it's criminal law or law, but even the law's confused about all of this, I would say. So here you have a problem where the worst impacts go to victims who haven't caused the problem, okay? It's also a problem, the longer you wait, the worse the problem gets, okay? It's also a problem that the longer you wait, the more difficult it will be to stabilize okay. There are features of this problem that make the uncertainty argument at its core an ethical question. If I were to say to you that if there's a physicist in Switzerland who wants to do a black hole experiment, which actually happened, okay, what level, and there's some theoretical possibility you could suck the entire universe into the black hole, how much level of confidence should that physicist be able to have before he goes ahead with the experiment? And most people would say, no, 95% confidence is not enough. Higher levels of confidence are in fact required. Levels of confidence and burdens of proof are ethical issues that have an amazing significance. Scientific uncertainty requires, if you're going to take a bet on the probability statement, the victims who's going to be harmed have a right to participate. There are procedural justice issues. There are issues about how do we think about uncertainty. We already promised not to use uncertainty in 1992, but you would never know by the way the press is covering this. You have politicians that are saying, just this past week, you have politicians saying, I don't think climate change is real, when every Academy of Science in the world is saying it is real, okay? There are issues about what politicians should be able to say. Politicians are different. They they have the ability to put the politicians is like the director of a train company who is told by his people that a train is speeding to a bus that has lots of people on it, and the politician can divert the train to not harm other people. Okay, a politician should not be able to use uninformed speculation about the science once the politician is put on notice by the most prestigious institutions in the world that the science is real. That creates responsibility. You can't just say, well, I don't think so. And why doesn't the press ask those politicians, well, who are you relying upon? Are you aware that the Academy of Science said it was real? The public discourse on this is so amazingly poor, given all this. Then on top of this, there's something called the Climate Change Disinformation Campaign, which is itself worthy of public interest, focus. This is some kind of new crime against humanity, I think. There's lots of sociologists are paying attention. We now have it all work. Who funded it? It was funded largely by fossil fuel companies and right-wing foundations. And they are using skepticism in science is a good thing. We should be encouraging skepticism. But this is not about skepticism. They are using techniques which are ethically abhorrent in talking about the science. They are telling lies about the science. Okay, they're saying you'll hear Senator Inhofe saying the entire thing is a hoax. How could it be a hoax when every Academy of Science in the world said it's real and it's really serious? Okay, so the skeptics are telling lies, or they're either lying or it's a reckless disregard for the truth. They're saying there's no evidence of human causation. That's not true. I can name 20 lines of evidence, all independent of human causation, but yet you have politicians saying that. And these people in the disinformation campaign have been using these tactics for 25 years. And that's really what stopped the US action. It's the disinformation campaign, which raises interesting ethical questions about how do we encourage skepticism, how do you deal with human technology impacts, which are really important, and we want to encourage skepticism, but we want people to play by certain rules of rationality. That in itself is worthy of lots of discussion. Another obvious ethical problem, what is the stabilization? What is the United States' position on the stabilization goal? Should it be 450 parts per million? No national strategy makes any sense at all. It makes no sense unless you understand a target to be implicitly positioned on the stabilization level. Where is the press covering that? Where has the press covered the US promise on 17% is a position on the stabilization goal, but it's obviously a position on the stabilization goal. And why do we argue against stabilization goal? Well, the science isn't certain enough, or it's not in our economic interest. The point is there are obvious ethical problems with doing that over and over again. I could talk about the target issue. The next big ethical question, which raises slightly different ethical questions, if you know you have 44 gigatons of carbon to distribute it, who gets them? Do historical emissions count? Do countries with, should we expect poor countries to do as much as rich countries? We've also acted that everybody just reduces by the same amount, okay? Ethics wouldn't have you say that. Most philosophers think that this is an issue with there are different theories of distributive justice, but there's not an infinite number of theories about distributive justice. And you can really, if we have a serious discussion, I think we could compromise among different theories of what distributive justice requires. You know, another thing you will hear, and we've heard it when the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated, there were commercials, those of you who are old enough to remember this, that were on TV every night. We shouldn't join the Kyoto Protocol because China's being cut out of the map. I don't know if you remember seeing that. Does a nation have a right to say, I don't have a duty to do anything unless everybody else does it? Given the fact that we're not asking the United States to do anything other than only its fair share, given the fact that we're already contributing to harms which are already happening, whether China does something or not, every additional ton in excess of whatever our fair share is hurts somebody. Can the US get away with, as a matter of ethics, saying we don't have to do anything because China hasn't done anything? Ethics would say, no, you can't do that. A defendant, I'm a former environmental lawyer, a defendant says, I can continue to pollute because we have 2 other polluters on the hill that are killing the people down in the valley, okay? You can't prosecute, you can't get me to do my fair share. No ethical system would condone that excuse, okay? And the rest of the world gets it. A monkey would get what's wrong with that. It's not a thorny ethical problem. There are huge issues about adaptation, who's responsible for adaptation. Most Americans don't know. This is fully engaged. The US has already agreed in principle. The developed countries have an obligation of producing $120 billion a year by 2020 to help developing countries with adaptation. Ethics would have those that are causing the problem start to pay for the damages. And if you want to wake up, if Americans don't wake up to the damage issue, it better wake up. If you're only worried about self-interest, adaptation costs and damages and losses are a huge issue that they're starting to try to negotiate in the climate negotiations. Okay, they're already on the table. There's a lot more discussed. There are rules of international law that help you think through who has to pay what. But some of you may know that most economists agree the costs of doing nothing, by the way, are orders of magnitude higher than the cost of taking this in action. The Stern report, the IPCC has reported that the mainstream consensus of scientific literature, the costs to the world are much greater than the 1% to 2% reduction in the GDP if we take this problem on. So if you're only worried about economic impacts, tell that to someone that get hit by Hurricane Sandy in northern Jersey. Okay, and so adaptation issues are on the table. We're not going to be able to duck them. We are not, either a court is going to assign liability or we're going to negotiate something on this. In fact, a lot has already happened. Do individuals, including individuals in rich and poor countries, have responsibilities? The answer, I believe, is yes. Okay, sometimes India and China get off the hook. If you've been to India and China, you know that not only are they producing emitters, but they're wasting a lot of energy now too. So you have large automobiles. So one of the interesting ethical questions is, what is our responsibility as individuals for this problem? Once you're put on notice that your emissions are going in the atmosphere and it's going to create the forcing, which is going to increase the harm and destabilize the system, ethics would say you have a duty to stop doing that. Okay, what is our individual responsibility? Let me pause here. I gave a talk on this in an audience about half the size, and I said, I know some people that are not meeting their ethical responsibility, and I'm going to name names. So I had secretly got everybody's picture, okay, including mine. I was the first. Okay, and the truth of the matter is, right now, the average global emission should be less than 2 tons per person to be on the glide path. And the US is about 19 tons per person. And the Chinese and Indians are trying to act as if rich people in their country can admit, even though the country may not have a responsibility, everybody has a responsibility for this. And so, I'm now ending up. I believe that this problem, speaking of revolution, there's not a day that goes by that I don't see a new human institution which is going to be challenged by this. Human rights law is challenged by this. This is a human rights problem. Refugee law is challenged by this. The world trade is challenged. The WTO doesn't fit this. I think this is going to affect many, many aspects of international law. I teach international law, and I wake up every day and say, oh my God, and that problem is there too. At the heart of this, and so I think knowing what I know, and I'm so happy to be here, I feel I have a responsibility to try to wake Americans up to the fact that this is a justice and moral problem. That's why I'm here. That's what I do. That's why I get out of bed, okay? I think Americans are good people. They will get it eventually. We will start to demonize unnecessary use of fossil fuels sooner or later. I'll tell you one quick story about that. The State Department, even though I wrote a book 10 years ago about the United States, they sent me to Scotland to speak to the Scottish Parliament about the ethics of climate change. They sent me to Scotland to speak about ethics, which we're not talking about here. And the Scottish Parliament was debating the toughest climate change law in the world, which they then passed 2 months later. And before I got up, about an hour before I got up, there was a Scottish parliamentarian who was debating the bill. And he looked out to the audience and he said several times, this is going to cost Scotland money. No doubt about that. But we have duties to the Africans. We have duties to the small island states. The Scottish parliamentarian made the argument that I'm trying to get politicians to make. And when I've seen the Scottish parliamentarian make that issue, I said, that's not controversial at all. That's obviously right. Okay, politicians can say this, I think. They think they can't say it because they will be attacked. But once you understand the science, everything I said follows from what the science is about. So one of the things I'm here to ask you to do is to get American politicians to make the moral argument, to get the press to make the moral argument. The press is awful on this stuff. Words fail me to describe how incompetent I think the press on this. So there are two parts of my strategy. One is you got to work at the national level, and you also have to work on the international level. And the ethics and how you get traction actually is slightly different depending upon whether you're working at the national level. At the national level, you got to get people to see that this is a moral problem, okay? And seeing it's a moral problem, the way we normally discuss this doesn't work for this kind of problem. And the way you get that to happen is to ask people questions that take positions on science and economics. So Senator Casey is a senator from my state of Pennsylvania. He got up before the Senate and said, I'm not going to support he's a Democrat, I'm not going to support a cap and trade bill or a tax bill because it will hurt the coal industry in Pennsylvania. someone should say to him, wait a minute, Senator, we understand why you're worried about the coal industry, but you deny that you have duties and responsibilities to the Africans about this problem. How are you satisfying that, okay? So if I'm right that this is a moral question, there's some obvious questions that we should ask of people that are taking these positions, which are not that theoretically difficult. It just requires you to think about it. I have a website called ethicsandclimate.org. I have 101 articles about how to make these arguments on my website. Much to my surprise, and why this happened, within 6 months of doing this, Time Magazine and CNN declared my website one of the best 15 websites on any environmental issue in the United States, okay? And what I point to about that is simply that I was filling a niche that no one else is filling. Not that what I do is that bright or brilliant, but the need to do this, once you start to see the ethical questions become so obvious, we need a lot of people doing that. So my website tells you how to make these arguments. The international level is really amazingly tricky, okay? Let me end with this, okay? So I'm sitting in my office about a year ago. I get an email from the Secretary General's office in the United Nations, and it started off as follows. We have been reading your blog. We would like to know if you'd like to come to advise the senior management of the United Nations how to integrate ethics into the negotiations. I said, wow, how did that happen? Okay, so they said, first we want to have a conference call and go through some of your views, and then we want you to come to the United Nations and we'll give you an audience with the most senior people at the United Nations about trying to figure out how to make this happen at the international level. We came up with 5 or 6 strategies. We're working through that. Everybody's starting to realize that we got it. We got to get people to see the equity dimensions. But the reason why they did it is because they figured out the ethics and justice is the key, okay? The people in the trenches figured out that nations are arguing as if only their economic interests count, and they're not taking responsibility for everyone else. It's not true of all nations. Some of the Northern European countries have been very, very good on this stuff for 25 years, which is a whole other interesting story. So there's a growing recognition by people that are in the middle of this that ethics and justice, but you need a different strategy to make this happen at the international level than you do at the national level. The elements of the strategy in both cases, though, are don't worry about what perfect justice requires, okay? Just spot the injustice of positions. Help people see that okay. We're going to have to compromise between countries on different ethical theories. There's nothing wrong with compromising, but you want to. This is about power and framing. These are democracy problems. This is a serious democracy problem. We've let people with economic interests frame this issue, and we haven't been smart enough to see what's wrong with it. And sociologists and philosophers tell you what the challenge for society always is to see what's wrong with the dominant discourse. Whether it was human rights or women's rights or civil rights, someone had to get up and say to their tribe, by the way, this is unacceptable morally, what you're doing. Okay, and real change happens, I think. There's a guy by the name of Apaya who's coming here pretty soon. He's at Princeton. He's written books about this. So justice is practically important to develop a social movement. Okay, we need a social movement that demonizes wasteful fields, and justice should be the tip of the spear, as it was in other things that we've seen happen in our lives. We need rapid social change, and when you need rapid social change, you need a social movement. And to make a social movement, you need people to say to our tribe, we know that what you're doing you think is right, but you have the problem of justice. You have the following justice. You don't want to attack them, but you want to help them think through the justice issues. So I'm finished. And as I said, if you don't find this interesting, there's 2 possibilities. I'm a bad teacher, or you have no beating heart, because this is, I think, amazing stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have a microphone for some questions.
We're faced with the possibility of an XL pipeline. Mm-hmm. What do we do?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because many in this room probably know that what got the environmental community against the pipeline was climate change, not the pipeline, okay? There's enough carbon in the Canadian tar stands, knowing what the budget is, that if you burn all the carbon, you way exceeded the budget. So what really triggered the environmental community to fight the pipeline was not the environmental impacts of the pipeline, it was the environmental impacts but no one knows that, okay? And the environmental community is not saying. I was at Washington with 30,000 people showed up. And the environmental community, the press is covering it as a pipeline story, okay? What are the adverse environmental impacts of the pipeline? The pipeline goes away if there's a cap on carbon anyway, okay? If you're worried about the carbon, so as an environmental lawyer, I think Obama's probably going to have to approve the pipeline because there are no, I mean, the United States is a spider web of pipelines. Okay, we approve pipelines all the time on environmental grounds. Sometimes we get them to move it, but you have to have a valid environmental reason. I think I could be wrong. Kerry really cares about climate change, the new Secretary of State, and he has the first say on this. But I think, in all probability, Obama's going to have to approve the pipeline. But why are we talking about it as a pipeline story? Climate change is much worse. It's much worse than the environmental impacts of that. And I actually, Bill McKibben, I don't know if you know who he is, I continue to send him email. I said, Bill, you're framing it the wrong way. The press and the politicians are gonna talk about the adverse impacts of the pipeline. And lo and behold, that's what is in fact happening. So we shall see.
There are two things that I'd like to ask you about. The first is that there's it seems to me, a 300-pound gorilla in the closet, which is population.
Right.
And if you cut the population in half or prevent it from doubling, you'd have roughly 50% effect on the CO2 in the atmosphere. And we're not talking about that. There are churches that object to that discussion. But we have to, and it should be mentioned at every one of these times, and I don't see anything like that in the press, speaking of things that are not in the press. The second question has to do with the frame of mind of many Americans, which is that we are exceptional. We don't have to compromise, that the UN is an evil institution because it makes America do things it doesn't really want to do. And that mindset is very, very embedded. And so we have to figure out some way to deal with that. What do political scientists or anybody who has some insight suggest we do, because facts don't matter to people like that.
You're absolutely right. Let me put the population question off. You're absolutely right. What has been happening with the disinformation campaign? There are public relations firms that have been hired by interested groups to scare the hell out of people. We now know how it was, and one of the arguments, this is the United Nations takeover. It's actually breaking out worse on sustainability than it is in climate speak. As we speak, there's a movement called the Anti-Agenda 21 movement. Public relations people are trying to figure out how to get the Americans not to react, and they're claiming that the idea of sustainability is the United Nations attempt to seize sovereign control. Well, I mean, we need to talk about that. There are some problems that are obviously can only be solved on a global scale. Okay, we don't say that every country in the world is free to develop its transportation rules. Okay, the way to fight that is that some problems you need global cooperation, or you don't solve the problem. Okay, the Europeans are much more sophisticated on this. They have something called the subsidiarity principle, which the average guy in the street can talk about this. Some things should be done at the local level, some have to be done at the regional level, but what the level of sovereignty is depending upon what kind of problem that you have. And we need to talk that up. We need to confront the people that are saying that anything that the United Nations is loosely connected with. There are hundreds of things that the United Nations actually already regulates because people have decided that it's in the global interest to have a global institution. And climate change is one of those problems, you know. But you need people of courage to make the argument. In the face, you're going to get attacked when you make the argument, I think. On population, yeah, population is the problem, but most people that have thought deeply about it think what we're doing as well as we're going to do, okay? Population is supposed to flatten out about 2040, 2050. There will be 11 billion people. The rate of population growth has really been going down in most of the world. As we've educated women, the population rates have increased dramatically. So all of the people that I know that would agree with you, population, think we're probably doing, they're actually, at the UN, it doesn't come up anymore. It used to come up 20 years ago, but they don't even talk about it anymore because the theoreticians think we're probably doing as well as population as we're going to do, and therefore we've got to think about the impacts on the planet with, you know, 12 to 14 billion people, okay? And there's just no other option, okay? So that's my take on it. I don't know what to do about it. A lot of it's already wired into economics and other things that we can't do little about. So that's the conventional wisdom. Yes. Yeah.
In regards to the global cooperation and everything, I completely agree that nations, developing nations like China and India should have you know, some type of being able to like help in the environmental regards, but when there's so much political turmoil and economic problems and different things involving that, how do you expect, or how do you go about enforcing this type of thing in a nation that you know has other priorities at the time, and as you said earlier, feels that they should have the same materials and the opportunity that, you know, nations like United States and a lot of places in Europe had?
Well, it's a very, very good question. The original treaty broke the world into two different parts. It broke the obligations of developed countries and developing countries in completely different regimes. The United States agreed to that. The United States agreed in the treaty. George Bush's father agreed the developed countries should go first because historically we've caused most of the problem. We have more economic resources. And part of the fight in the negotiations are what are the responsibilities of developing countries, particularly the middle income countries like India and China and so forth. As this has been going on, they're starting to wake up how bad this is for them too, okay? China and India are now starting to say all the right things. I don't know if you know, just this week, China announced it's going to tax carbon before we do. There was a cap on carbon in the last 5-year plan. They have more installed solar and wind than we do right now. What the reality on the ground is, I don't know. I'm not saying that China is okay. In order to figure out what's really going on, you'd have to be living there thinking about this all the time. But China's starting to say all the right things. I've just been invited a visiting professorship next year at Nanjing University. I'm probably going to go and spend 6 months trying to figure out what's actually happening. But you can't let people say we can't do this because China's not doing it, because we got to do our fair share, okay? That's buying into the wrong argument, I would argue. But how you get them to do it, they're waking up to how bad environmentally this is. China's really waking up to it, and India's too. The monsoons have been really unstable in the last few years. There's hundreds of millions of people that live near sea level rise. So all of the developing countries are now putting plans together. Every one of them is starting to articulate what it's going to do. So just in the last 2 years, there's more movement. Now, the only difference is right now in the negotiations, the plans of the developing countries are called nationally appropriate emissions reductions, and they're not legally binding. So Obama convinced them all to put together a plan The plan is being paid for by the developed countries, including the United States. The science and the planning, it's all ongoing. They're doing it. It's scientifically pretty good. They're developing strategies. But it's an important thing to pay attention to. Some of the developing countries will say, I'm not going to do anything because development is my number one priority. But that's actually changing.
I'm a bit surprised that in your discussion of this, you haven't mentioned the classical notion of tragedy of the commons.
Right.
And I'm sure everybody knows what this is. But in terms of thinking our way towards a solution to a problem that is that, there are precedents in terms of fisheries, natural resources. What does the historical record tell us about the success of these that we've had in dealing with diverse interest groups and tragedies of the common situation, and does it teach us anything about what we can do now?
Yep. Good question. There are actually some success examples in tragedy of the commons problems. Fisheries is one example where you have global fisheries, which are common resource properties, and the way that's been solved for some fisheries, but not all fisheries, is get all the fishing countries to develop a quota, what their fair share is. You probably know the ozone hole is another problem. One of the really interesting legal problems is the atmosphere a public trust resource, okay? If it's which is another really interesting, because if it's a public trust resource, no country has any prescriptive or property right to use it as a sink. Zero, none, okay? The US continues to argue as if we should be able to get in only reduce emissions because we were there first, okay? And we just have to reduce the same percentage. So the issue becomes an important element in how do you think about what each nation's fair share is. Most philosophers think that the fair share has to take per capita allocations into account because every human being should have an equal right to use the sink as a source, okay? Now there are variations of the per capita. I think there are 5 or 6 frameworks which are under serious discussion in international negotiations, but they all play around with they start with the per capita. Distributive justice, this is a classic problem called distributive justice. Distributive justice doesn't require you to treat everybody equally, but it starts with equality. So you can get more of something, but you have to have a morally relevant reason for getting more of, okay? So that's how we should pursue this, okay? And so the problem with per capita is most philosophers think that there's something called contraction and convergence, which many of the countries in the world think is the way to solve the fair share. And the idea is eventually we've got to develop the atmospheric sink capacity on a per capita basis. It's the only fair way to do it. But everyone realized the developed countries, that would be, the United States says, over my dead body will we even talk about this. The US has been the opposition on this. So the developing countries said, well, we realize you can't do this tomorrow or the next year. We'll give you 40 years to merge on a per capita allocation. It's called contraction and convergence. Everyone I know thinks that that's very reasonable. You can deal with historical emissions by changing the convergence rate. You can deal with some of the other practical problems. But there's a real interesting issue about is the atmosphere of common resources. That creates certain societal norms which we are completely ignoring. Before I hear that question, I failed to mention, if the United States were to do a per capita share, instead of, the science says the whole world must reduce its emissions by between 60 and 80% by 2050, okay, US share becomes 97% reduction. And so the US looks and say, whoa, we're not going to go there. Don't put that on the table because it has a really bad. And that doesn't take historical emissions. The Brazilians want the world to take historical emissions to be part of the performance. And the US is way farther than China on historical emissions. So.
All right. Thank you very much, first of all, for a very interesting talk. So one of the things that you mentioned is that, on average, every individual in the United States needs to decrease their emissions by about 90%. Right. What are your top 3 ways that's going to happen? I mean, is this personal choice? Is it infrastructure? Is it legislation? What do people, like I think a lot of people in this room who really want to be good citizens, how do we do that?
But you don't have options that allow you to get to the 2 times, okay? So what do you do when you can't get there? You would like to, but you can't. And I simply tell people, do the best you can. Some of the things that we needed are things outside of your control. We need political fixes too. We need different kinds of transportation systems. We need different options for fuel. So one of the things you should be doing, in fact, I actually argue the most important thing you should be doing is try to change the political system to get the politics to do things that only the politics, in fact, can do. The government intervention in the market is absolutely necessary. We live in a world in the United States. We think, markets will solve all problems. Markets won't solve this problem without government intervention. You got to tell the market what it wants. But you should also reduce your carbon emissions to the extent that you can. There are churches in Europe that are getting everybody to do a carbon footprint. The Scottish Church has everybody doing a carbon footprint. Universities should be doing a carbon footprint. But you try to get everybody to do a carbon footprint and to start to make the reductions consistent with what you think should be done. And ethics would actually require you to not only to not stop at what your fair share is, it's to get rid as much as you want. This is a human rights problem. And human rights says you got to do whatever you can do to give people their human rights. There's basic human dignity that is involved in it. But we also need to turn up the volume in the United States. We need a social movement getting people to see that you don't want to condemn people for not making their carbon footprint. That's wrong. A lot of people didn't choose to live where they live. They didn't understand the problem. Your real responsibility starts once you start to understand this problem. You can't duck the ethical issues anymore. I can't duck them. And you can offset all your emissions. You could have 0 carbon footprint if you want. If you want to buy offsets, that's how I justify me flying where I fly. So you could have a 0 carbon footprint. There are interesting questions about whether offsets should sort of make up for 0 carbon, so there's a really difference of opinion about that. But you could have 0 tomorrow if you had the money to buy the offsets to offset your emissions, and some people are in fact doing that, okay? In Europe, it's much more prevalent. And the Scottish Presbyterian Church is trying to get every member of the church to have a carbon footprint and to approach a global average. That will come here if the science is right. We're not going to duck that. We need to talk about that issue.